Hello and welcome to this webinar. My name is Bjorn Kvale, and I'm a product marketing engineer at Nordic Semiconductor. I will be the moderator of this webinar, and together with me I have Hung Bui and Haakon Helsing. They're both senior application engineers working in the tech support group. Petter Myhre has unfortunately been sick, so he can't join us today. But luckily, we have a very experienced application engineer, Hung Bui, who will present Petter's part. So just some of the practicalities. Duration will be roughly 50 to 60 minutes. I'd say about 60 minutes for the presentation, and then we'll do a 10-minute Q&A at the end. Questions are, of course, encouraged, and please type questions in the chat. This is because our webinar tool only allows all of the hosts to see the questions in the chat. So not if you type a question in the question bar. I've disabled this now. So just be aware that the chat is not anonymous. So if you're worried about that, you should maybe ask a question on Nordic Dev Zone instead. Also try to keep the questions relevant to the topic. So we noticed in the morning session that we had some questions on qualifications, Bluetooth Low Energy qualifications, and that's not that relevant to the topic, which is Bluetooth Low Energy advertising. So that's just a friendly reminder. And Hung and Haakon, they'll be answering questions during the webinar and also towards the end of the webinar. So just feel free to ask any questions during the chat. And like I mentioned, if you do have any more questions, please don't hesitate to use Nordic Dev Zone. And last but not least, a recording of the webinar will be available together with a presentation and a Q&A at webinars.nordicsemi.com. Like I mentioned, today's hosts are Hung Bui and Haakon Helsing. And just quick agenda, Hung will go through basics, advertising extensions, advertising types, advertising data forms, data format, and then Haakon will go through NRF Connect SDK API and advertisement analysis with the NRF Sniffer. And so he'll also go through a few demos. So I hope you enjoy that. And without further ado, I think we'll just start.
Hi everyone, my name is Hung. I'm a senior application engineer working in technical support. And today I will give you an introduction to advertising in Bluetooth Low Energy. So we'll start with the basic. What is advertising? So a broadcaster advertises to broadcast data. So it can be like sensor data, like humidity data, or it can contain the name of the device, it contains the temperature data, any kind of data. And it's not only the data is contained in the advertising packet, it also contains other information. For example, RSSI. RSSI information is received signal strength indication. It can tell how strong the signal is to tell if the device is in the proximity of the scanner or not. This can be used for example, on virus contact tracing, for example. It can also include IQ data that's useful for direction finding, one of the new features in Bluetooth 5.1. The second use of advertising packet is to allow the peripheral to advertise itself as a discoverable device so that the central device can establish a connection to the peripheral. So it's a very important part of Bluetooth Low Energy, where advertising is the way that you can establish a connection. There are two types of advertising. Legacy advertising, which is defined in Bluetooth 4.0 until 4.2. And then we have extended advertising that's defined in 5.0. Both of them are still used now. So, but we will focus on the legacy advertising first. First, we talk about different gap roles and link layer states. There are 4 gap roles for each of the Bluetooth Low Energy device. Gap role is defined on the gap layer, which is upper layer, the host layer of the stack. And there are 4 types: broadcaster, observer, peripheral, and central. When you are a broadcaster on the link layer, which is the lower layer, you only do advertising. When you observer, you do scanning. And when you are peripheral, you can do advertising or you can enter connection as a slave. And when you are central, you can do scanning, you can initiate a connection, and you can enter the connection. So all roles can also be in standby state where the radio is not active. So by having the roles, now we have a look at the topology now. So when you are a broadcaster, you advertise, and it can either be connectable or non-connectable advertising. And when you are observer, you do scanning, you receive advertising packet, you collect the advertising packet. And when you are a central, you scan for packet from peripheral. The peripheral advertise itself to tell the central that it exists here, and the central can establish a connection. The central then can, after receiving the advertising packet, can send a connection request, and then they can enter a connection. So that's why advertising is very important, because before you can establish a connection, the peripheral have to advertise. So we now look into how the advertising is done. It is in this case we have a device advertising with interval of 20 milliseconds. But you can see here we have the interval is not actually 20 milliseconds, but is deviated. So there is a 0 to 10 millisecond random delay on each advertising event. The reason why there's a random delay added is that to avoid, for example, 2 advertisers having the same connection interval, they will be collide all the time if there's any random delay. So by having this, we avoid that 2 advertiser can has a contention and always advertise at the same time, causing interference and making them unable to be discoverable or scannable. And you can see here we advertise on 3 channels. So by default, any advertising packet is repeated on all 3 advertising channels, 37, 38, 39. Let's have a look at the spectrum. So here is a spectrum for Bluetooth Low Energy. We have 40 channels. Each channel is 2 megahertz each. And you can see that channel 37, 38, 39 are located here. The reason why these channels is selected for advertising is that these channels are the least activity for Wi-Fi. So Wi-Fi usually happen most activity here, and those 3 channels are the least active channels for Wi-Fi, and you have more chance of transmitting data without collision with Wi-Fi in these channels. That's why they are selected. And the reason why it have to be sent in 3 channels is for redundancy, because if one of the channels is crowded or there's a lot of collision on one channel, you still have a chance to be able to scan for the data on different channels. So here we are looking at the scanner. The scanner usually can only scan for 1 channel at a time, because most of the time the scanner only has 1 antenna, so it has to scan for 1 channel at a time. And here we are looking at a scanner that has a scan interval at 20 milliseconds and a scan window of 10 milliseconds. And here we see that it can receive the packet when it scans on channel 37. It can receive the advertising packet on channel 37. When it scans on channel 38, it can receive on 38, and when it's received scan on 39, can receive the packet on channel 39. And yeah, if for some reason, if the channel 38 is has a lot of congestion and interference, you can see that the scanner can still capture the packet on channel 37 and 39. That's why there's some redundancy here, that the advertising packet is retransmitted 3 times on 3 channels. Next, we have a look at the different advertising types. So for legacy advertising, there are 4 types. First is advertising indication int, which is the most common type, which is scannable and connectable. Scannable means that it support scan request and scan respond to transmit more data. We will talk about that later on. And the second type is IDV scan int, meaning that it's non-connectable but it's scannable. And then we have the non-connectable int, which is non-scannable, non-connectable. Again, scannable here doesn't mean that it cannot be scanned. It only means that this packet doesn't support scan request and scan respond, but it's still scannable. Other scanner can still scan it. And then we have directed advertising, which is not scannable but connectable. We will talk about this later on. And then we have extended advertising type. This is the new advertising extension features in 5.0, Bluetooth 5.0 that I mentioned before. And then you have 4 more types, which is extended advertising, advertising on data channel, sync advertising, and chain advertising. We'll talk about advertising extension at the end of this session. So again, for each gap role, you have different advertising types. So when you are a broadcaster, you can advertise in scannable or non-connectable advertising. But when you are peripheral, you can advertise in all 4. So if you do not support a connection, you cannot advertise as a normal IDV int. You have to advertise in one of these 2 advertising types. So I was mentioning about scan request and scan respond. When it say scannable, that means that it supports scan request. So let me show you here. A broadcaster is broadcasting on 37, 38, and now it's broadcasting on 39, same data. And when you do scannable, you have to switch to RX, switch to radio to receiver mode right after you transmit the data. This is so that the scanner can send a scan request and you would be able to receive the scan request because you switch to receiver mode. And after you receive the scan request from the scanner, you need to send a scan respond. If you don't have any data, you can send an empty scan respond, but you need to send a scan respond back. And the scan respond can contain more data. So for normal advertising packet, you have up to 31 bytes. But if you want to transmit more than 31 bytes, you can use a scan respond to send 31 more bytes, up to 31 more bytes to the scanner. So it extends the advertising data you can send. And for connection request, so this is very similar to a scan request, but here is when you want to establish a connection. So the same, you have to switch to RX mode when you support connection request, and when you receive a connect request, inside this it will contain the information about the connection, and then from here you will switch to a connection. So this is how the connection is established. The scanner scan for the advertising packet and send a connect request when you are as a peripheral switch to receiver. But as you can see that when you do scannable and when you do connectable, you have to switch to receiver mode, meaning that the radio have to be on longer. And if you don't want to support the scan request or connect request and you want to save more power, for example, if you are only a beacon, you don't plan to support any connection or scan request, you can choose to advertise as a non-connectable and non-scannable. And when you do that, the radio only stay in DX mode and then sleep right after that. You can save the most power by doing non-connectable. Next, we talk about advertising interval. I was showing you the example of doing 20 millisecond advertising. So when you do non-connectable or you do connectable, scannable, you can choose advertising interval from 20 milliseconds up to 10.24 seconds in the step of 0.625 milliseconds. And then I mentioned we have a random delay added on each of the advertising event. So there's a trade-off between power consumption and device discovery time. So if you want your data to be received by your scanner or your device can be connected by the central or the phone quicker, you need to advertise faster, more often, with lower advertising interval. But that also means that you will consume more power. So if you want to prolong your device battery life, you need to advertise slower. So there is a trade-off between device discovery time and power consumption. And it's quite important because for many devices, you will stay in advertising mode most of the time because you don't enter connection mode all the time. You only send data, you only communicate to central when you need, like when you want to sync up the data, when you want to transmit a lot of data, you enter the connection mode and then you disconnect after that. So most of the time, the device will stay in advertiser or broadcaster mode most of the time. So it's very important to choose a good advertising interval so that it's balanced out between device discovery time, how long it would take for the central or for the phone to be able to connect to your device, and the battery life, the power consumption. And then we have scan interval and scan windows. This also decide how quickly the central can scan and capture your advertising packet and then maybe establish a connection. And if you have a short interval and a scan window that can cover a large part of the scan interval, there's more chance that you'll be able to capture the advertising packet. So this also help with the device discovery time. And many times you have more power on the central side. Maybe it's a plug-in device or it has a bigger battery like on the phone. So you should leverage the scanner if possible. So because it has bigger battery. So instead of increase the advertising or reduce the advertising interval to transmit more often, you can reduce the scan interval and increase the scan window to be able to capture more of the advertising packet if you have more power on the scanner side. The next one is the directed advertising. This is kind of a special way of doing advertising. It is to quickly reconnect to a known central. So if you already pair to a central or you know the central address, you can advertise very quickly with very low advertising interval to be able to re-establish a connection. Think about a mouse or keyboard and you somehow disconnected and you want to reconnect as quick as possible so that the user wouldn't be able to notice that the connection has been dropped or is the transition would be smooth. So you can do directed advertising in that case. And there are two types of two duty cycle for directed advertising. You can do low duty cycle, meaning that the time between two advertisements shall be less or equal to 10 milliseconds. You can see that it's already lower than the minimum 20 milliseconds for the normal advertising. Or you can do high duty cycle, meaning that the interval shall be less or equal to 3.75 milliseconds. And but when you do high duty cycle, the maximum duration of doing high duty cycle is 1.28 seconds is the maximum, because you don't want to do a lot of advertising for a long period. It will create a congestion on the advertising channels. So if you do high duty cycle, you can only do it in a very short period of time. If you want to do directed advertising for longer time, you need to switch to low duty cycle. Then you don't have a limited maximum duration in that case. And then we have a whitelist. Whitelist is can be used when you don't want your advertiser to need to respond to all of the requests from all of the scanner or central. If you have already pair or known the address of the scanner or the central that you want to allow access, you can set up a whitelist. The whitelist contain the device addresses or or identity resolving keys (IRKs) that the advertiser shall accept scan requests and or connection requests from. So all other requests from other central or scanner will be filtering out, and you will not respond to those scanner. And this typically belong to devices bonded with, because IRK should only be shared when you are already bonded to the device. And IRK is used to generate a random address, a private resolvable addresses. I give the example of contact tracing again. So when if you just keep advertising with the same address all the time, people with a scanner can detect where you are because your address doesn't change. But if you can use an IRK and you generate resolvable private address periodically, like every 15 minutes, people wouldn't be able to track you down because if they don't have the IRK, they cannot resolve it, and it just appear at a random number. But if you have a bonded device, it will be able to detect you, and by using the IRK to resolve the address. So next is the advertising data. We'll have a look on the format of the advertising packet, what inside the advertising packet. So the advertising PDU protocol data unit consists of a 2-byte header, 16 bits, and a payload from 1 to 255 octets. But I mentioned before, for legacy advertising, the payload is up to 31 bytes. Inside the PDU header, you will have the PDU types, the 4 types of advertising that I mentioned before: normal, connectable advertising, directed advertising, non-connectable, or scannable advertising. And then we have the bit here, the rest here. First bit is reserved for future use. The second bit is the channel selection. It will tell the central that if the every channel selection algorithm 2 is supported or not. And then we have the DX address and RX address to tell if the type of the address, if it's a public address or it's a random address. And then we have the length of the payload. So here we show you the maximum size of the payload. So for normal advertising IDV int, we have the first 6 octet is the address of the advertiser, and then we have 0 to 31 byte for advertising data. So in total, the payload can get up to 37 bytes. It's the same to non-connectable and scannable. The special directed advertising, you can have up to, you don't have any payload. What you have is the advertiser address and the target address, because it's directed to a central. So there shouldn't be any data sent in this directed advertising. The reason is that when you do directed advertising, you advertise with very short advertising interval. And if you transmit data in this, it will congest more of the advertising channel. So you should send very short packet when you do directed advertising. So for the address, you can have either, I mentioned this bit, tell that it's a public address or it's a random address. When it's a public address, it's a unique address that can be recognized. Yeah, most of the devices now doesn't use a public address anymore because there's no privacy on this, and this device stick to your this address stick to your device, and people can use this address to track you. So most of the device now use a random address. It can be a static random address, or it can be a private, non-resolvable, or resolvable. I mentioned about resolvable before. So resolvable can be used so that a bonded device can recognize you even though you change your address randomly, but it still can be resolvable using the IRK that you share. We go back to the payload now. We're going to look into this advertising data now. So inside this advertising data, I mentioned up to 31 bytes. You can have multiple of advertising structure 1, structure 2, structure 3. Yeah, they are all inside this advertising data packet. And inside the structure, you will have the first octet or first byte is the length. Come right after the length is the ID type. It can be 1 byte, 2 byte ID types. And then you have the actual data, which size is equal to length minus n octet, 1 or 2 octet. Depends on the types. So with those 3 normal advertising packets, you can have up to 31 bytes with all of the overhead. You can see here that we have 1 byte overhead and can be 2 byte type overhead here, so it can be already 3 bytes overhead. So you don't have, and each of this will have an overhead. So you don't have much for your data, your actual data here. And I mentioned for directed advertising, you don't have space for payload, only have the space for addresses. So the ID type that I mentioned here is defined in the Bluetooth Core specification supplement called CSS. Instead of the core spec, you need to look into the CSS documentation to find all the types. And the most common ID types we can find in advertising packet, you can see is service UID, local name, flags, or manufacturer specific data. For example, service UID is typically included in connectable advertisements so that the central node the supported service without connecting. For example, if you have a heart rate sensor, it should include the heart rate service UID in the advertising packet so that as a central device, when it scans for a heart rate sensor, and it will find this UID in the advertising packet and knows that, okay, this device support heart rate, and I can connect to collect data about heart rate from this device. The second common advertising type is a local name. Is include the connectable for connectable advertisement so that the human user can select the device to connect. For example, heart rate sensor, or can contain a specific name for it. It can be short name, which is the type 00 hexa 08, or the complete name, which is hexa 09, which contain the name. And then we also have the flags. Flags shall be included in if any of the flag bit are non-zero and the advertising packet is connectable. Here are the 5 flags that you can use. Can be limited discoverable mode, meaning that you will advertise in a limited time. It's not like limited. Not all the device can scan for it. It's more about the time it advertise. So this is limited. It should mean that it doesn't advertise this forever. When you do general discoverable mode, that means you don't have a limited time you do this. It can be you can do this advertising forever. And this flag is used if you doesn't support BR EDR, meaning Bluetooth Classic. And the other the last two flags used when you support both Bluetooth Classic and Bluetooth LE, either on the lower layers controller or on the host layer. This is the case with most of the phone, and this is with the only Bluetooth Low Energy device. You may want to set this flag to 1. And then many of our customers asking how can they advertise their own proprietary data is when you need to do manufacturer specific data as a ID type. So the first two octet of this, so the type you should select FF, and then the first two octets in the payload should contain your company identifier. It is from the list of company identifier assigned number, and is free to obtain from as a Bluetooth SIG member. So if you join Bluetooth SIG, you can obtain your own 2 bytes company identifier to be used here. So that was the quick introduction to the legacy advertising. Now we talk about those new features in Bluetooth 5.0, which is called advertising extensions. There are 5 new added features here. First, we increase the advertising data length. Second, we allow advertising on data channels, so not only on those 3 channels, 37, 38, 39, but now it can also advertise on data channel, sorry. And then we enable long-range connection establishment using an advertising extension. So if you want to establish when using long-range PHY, which is the new features in Bluetooth 5, you need to use advertising extension. Then we have chaining, so we can chain multiple advertising packets together. And we also have periodic advertising. So let's have a look at each of them. Increased advertising data length. I mentioned before we have up to 31 bytes advertising payload and 37 bytes including the headers. And it was for legacy advertising. With advertising extension, we still have 2 byte headers, but now we have up to 255 byte payloads, which you can have 254 byte data, and you can choose to have 0 byte header or up to 63 byte extended header. So you can see that now you can transmit a lot more data in the advertising packets compared to before. Before you limit to 31 byte advertising data plus 31 byte for scan response packet, so up to 62 bytes with a lot of overhead inside that. So it's quite limited to transmit data over advertising, but now with extended advertising you can transmit a lot more, up to 254 bytes payload. The second thing is that for legacy advertising you need to repeat your advertising packet on all 3 channels by default. So the same data has to be transmitted on all 3 channels, but with advertising extension we can choose to only transmit the header on the advertising channels, and then you can choose a channel in the data channel. So I mentioned about 40 channels used for Bluetooth Low Energy, and 3 channels for advertising, and 37 channels for data. Now you can choose one of the 37 channels for data to send actual data, and when we do that, we only occupy the advertising channel for the headers, and we send the data in the data channel. So the advertising channels we only use to send the header, and the actual payload we send in the data channels. And why so important? The reason is that now we have longer payload. As I mentioned, we have up to 255 or 54 bytes payload, and if you retransmit that 3 times, it can occupy the advertising channel quite long. And especially when we do long range, meaning that we use 8 symbol to encode 1 bit, meaning that the packet now can be 8 times longer. So for a 255 byte payload, it can get up to 2040 bit, and each bit is encoded with 8 symbol on coded file. We are looking at 16,320 symbol, and that means it occupies the radio for more than 16 milliseconds, 16.32 milliseconds. So you don't want to do that on those 3 channels for advertising and repeated that 3 times. So it's very important on these features so that we can switch to one of the data channel, one of the 37 data channels to transmit the advertising data. So by having this, we can reduce contention, the competition for resources, and can reduce the duty cycle. And then if 255 bytes is not enough for you, you want to transmit more than that, you can change advertising packet together to extend the amount of advertising data. So in this header, I mentioned before, the header will contain the channel that it will, the data channels that it will advertise. In the header inside the data channel, you will also tell which channel you will send the next packet and on which interval, how long, when will you send the next advertising packet after this packet. So they are chained together, and here we are sending 3 packets. They don't have to be the same. They are actually the long package that's split into 3 255 packets here. So this is how you can transmit much longer, bigger data with chain advertising. Something quite similar to chain advertising is called periodic advertising. This is not the same. So here we enable synchronized broadcasting of advertising data, and is a header now will tell when it will broadcast the data. And if they are not chained together, you don't need to listen to all of them to have a big package. When you get this scan and receive the header, you know when the advertising packet will be transmitted in the data channel and where, on which channel it will be transmitted. With those information, you can just listening to those periodic advertising packets. It's not changed, it's periodic, and you can just open RX mode and listen on those interval. So we are seeing a connectionless broadcasting here. So multiple scanner can just receive the data all at the same time, and this is bigger, allowing more central or scanner to receive the packet. Before we have a star topology, so you only send data to one central at a time, but now with this periodic and connectionless broadcasting, you can have multiple scanner to receive your data on data channel. This is used also in direction finding. So in this, it will contain the IQ data to be able to calculate the angle of arrival or angle of departure for direction finding. But we will not cover direction finding in this session. So that was the theory part. Next, we will get into the example walkthrough and demo by Haakon.
Hello, my name is Haakon Helsing. I'm a senior application engineer working in the technical support team. I will show you how to quickly get started advertising and how you can analyze what you are advertising by using the NRF Sniffer for Bluetooth LE. We have prepared a demo for today, and this setup with the hardware looks like this. There's a board here which is advertising. It's running the application that we will go through and modify step by step. And here is the NRF Sniffer application running, and from this board we are recording continuously a sniffer trace. That little LED is letting us know that packets are detected, and in this window here you can see what it looks like when packets are coming in continuously. In this session we will cover how to find your own packets and how to examine them, and we will go to the source code of the advertising example, make some modifications of the parameters, and then try to find those changes reflected in the packets we receive. So yeah, first I will show how we got this set up, and then we will start doing some modifications. Yeah, so we are using NRF Connect SDK, which you'll see here. And if you haven't already, you can install and get started by clicking here. And if you're already done doing that, you can jump to the documentation and just make sure you're on the right tag. 131 is what we will be using today, and most of today's material is covered in the Zephyr RTOS documentation. Down here you'll find the API reference, and under Bluetooth and generic access profile is where most of what we cover will be located. Here you see things like minimum, maximum interval, and advertising as connectable or non-connectable, and non-connectable with a name. Those are what we will be using, or some of them. And if we jump back a couple steps, then this is where we find samples and demos, and today we have picked a Bluetooth scan and advertise sample. We will not be covering scanning, so I will just mention that the data we advertise in this sample is just the number of packets that this application has detected. So the application just counts packets, and that number is what we advertise. So so that's the sample that we will use as a starting point. In order to detect what we advertise, we use and set up the NRF Sniffer for Bluetooth LE. It's a step-by-step guide here you can follow and get things ready. Basically, you just need to install, run through some installation, and then program one of these development kits with the Sniffer application. And today we will be using the NRF 52840 DK for the Sniffer. Yeah, so when we will soon look at the source code of our advertiser. But first we will jump to a slide on how we configure Seger Embedded Studio, or how we configure our project in Seger Embedded Studio. So if you are one of the lucky ones who has got an NRF 5340 SoC, then you do need to follow this first step. And if you have a 52 series device, you can skip the first step and just go to the next step. So the first step here is to prepare the network core of your dual core device. So you do that by flashing the HCI RPMSG sample onto your network core. So just make sure it says CPU net here when you flash that sample. And then you build and run in Seger. And when that's done, you can jump to the next step, which is opening a new project again. And if you have a 52 series device, you can start here. So here we pick our scan advertising device, which is found on your computer, where you put your NCS tag. Well, before we jump to the code, we will actually look at the examples that we will cover today. So the first scan advertising example from Sniffer, then we will make sure our device gets a static address, and then we will give it a name that we can recognize along with a company ID. Next we will change the advertising interval, and then we will let the device provide a scan response, and in that response we will send more data, and if we have the time we will show how to make our device connectable. Here's the code. Our examples are all built on the scan adv sample, and some code will be enabled and disabled for each example by using this example number defined here. So for the unmodified scan adv sample, we'll look at what's going on. So first we will have a Bluetooth Low Energy advertising non-connectable device, and the data we send is called AD here, and we'll look at what AD consists of. So AD is the manufacturer data, and the manufacturer data is initially FF, which is used for when you test your device or just do some experimentation. So let's see if we can find any of these parameters in our with NRF Sniffer. So here's the Sniffer application, and here you see packets coming in. So if I filter here by RSSI, can see packets with a very good signal, but they all have different addresses. And I'll stop it here since we already have recorded a lot of packages. So we will examine the packet. So here I click each row is a packet, and down here you can see all the bytes in that packet. And if you click on some bytes like the FFFF, then you'll see the interpretation of the data in these packets. And that interpretation is the company ID done. So the interpretation is done by NRF Sniffer. And if we like, we can sort by, or we can filter by this ID. So you can see that this packet here is an advertising non-connectable, and the type of data is manufacturer specific, and which is what we configured it to be, and the data is here 4A, so that's the number of packets that our sample has counted and transmitted. So it counted for a number of packets and transmitted that as the manufacturer specific data. So you can click down here and it highlights up here, and the opposite. So yeah, you might notice that here they all have the packets look fairly similar, but they all come from different sources, and that is because our device is actually changing its address all the time, and that's because it has a default privacy option enabled, and we will disable that in the next example. So here you can see the channels of these packets. So if we filter on the company ID and sort the packets by the time, so that they are listed chronologically, then you can see that packets are listed or that they are advertised on channel 37, 38, 39, and then 39, yeah, so it one after the other. And it looks like I have another device, or yeah, this is the thing when you haven't set a static address, you easily get confused whether the packets are actually from your device or from some other device with very similar setup. So we'll go to example number 2. In this example, we will make the address static, and we will change the name and the company ID. We just select example number 2, and now we have created something called BTLE adv non-connectable ID. And in the first example, we just used something that was called this, that was already defined, and now we define our own. And that's because we want to use 2 flags, and one is the option to use identity, so that we're not changing address all the time, and the other is the option to use a name. And if you just put this here, then the default name will be Zephyr. But if you go to the project conf file, then you can easily change the name of your device. We can try to configure our name, and if we save this, and so we need to add this line here to the project config file, and we need to remember to reload So now that the project is reloaded, I can build and run, and I will make this look faster. And now we can soon look for our new company ID, as well as a static address. Let's take a look at the Sniffer. We are recording lots of packets, and yeah, it can sometimes be difficult to find the correct name here, and this will be our device. So it's called Zephyr when it's using the default name. So let's examine one of these packets and open it here. So you can see the company ID is now 0059 Nordic Semiconductor. And the address is static. Now that the address is static, we can go down and see all the packets coming in all the time. You can see scanner requests from other devices, and we can pause. And yeah, it's easier for development to have a static address, and probably also useful for a few other things. Let's stop this and move back to the next example. We'll change to example number 3 and take a look at the code that appears when we enable it. Yeah, now we're changing to a slower connection interval. A slower advertising interval, and this will of course help us save our battery, because the longer you can sleep in between the advertisement, then the longer your battery lasts. If you want to check out what intervals you can choose, then here are the ones predefined, and yeah, just pick whatever suits. We will not be building this example, and rather just jump to number 4, the scan response, and where we send more data. So in the data we want to send is a random UUID that we have generated, and this is usually not possible to send in your in the first advertising packet. So that's why we need to send it in the scan response. So if someone scans our device and send a scan request, then this UUID will be sent in return, and we call the data SR for scan response, and we include it here. So when we start advertising, we also include a scan response. And when Zephyr see that we have a scan response, it will help us send this scan response. So let's build. And we will make this look faster. And we're ready. Let's see how that went. Yeah, so here's actually here's our advertising packet, and here's a scan request. So some device was reading our advertising and sent a scan request, and then our scan response is here. It is including our scan response data here. The 128-bit UUID is also recognized as a 128-bit service class UUID. And here you can see the device name is Zephyr.
Okay, so thank you all for this webinar. I think the easiest thing regarding the certification, either we'll send it via email or we'll actually post it also on webinars.nordicsemi.com. I'm not too sure, but we will send out a certification for those that want a certification. And like I said, if you have any more questions, either ask on Nordic Dev Zone for technical questions or ask sales-related questions in the forum and in the link that I sent. And also be sure to check out our events page for more webinars. We're doing quite a few webinars. So if you enjoyed this webinar and want to check out more, make sure to go to nordicsemi.com/events. And last but not least, webinar recordings, Q&A, and slides will be posted on webinars.nordicsemi.com. I hope you all enjoyed this webinar, and I hope you have a nice evening or have a nice rest of the day. Thank you. Bye.